Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming to the Cyber Operations and Risk Management Briefing. Today, I'm going to be going over several different aspects of risk management and cyber operations as it relates to software development, software acquisition. Talk about software assurance needs and various expectations for security and risk. We're going to talk about the different risks and vulnerabilities in the different areas concerning software, including third-party partners, the software itself, the software development cycle, and then I'm going to go into the supply chain and different options that we have for purchasing or developing software for the organization. So being a part of Her Majesty's government, the organization requires that all software have a high level of assurance that it's going to be safe and going to be usable and effective. There's several aspects that go into that, though. The software development lifecycle itself has different vulnerabilities. It needs to be checked for tampering and malicious code that could have been put into the software while it was written or while it was in transit. It needs to be effective. It needs to actually do and fulfill the purpose for which it's being developed or being acquired. There's different supply chain complexities that come into place when you add developers, add resellers, add in-between people. All of those people become a part of the chain, and if one of those chains is weak, then security cannot be assured anymore. And even after all of that, there's still got to be testing involved with the software to ensure that it runs well, is effective, and that it is free of security vulnerabilities or malicious code that is in there that we are not aware of or that we cannot mitigate. So in talking about those risks, I'm going to go over the risks and vulnerabilities within the current software and software development cycle. First part to consider are third-party members. The risk with having third-party members involved is just that we do not have as much control over them as we do our own employees, our own workers. They're often in another building. We don't know them. We don't do their paychecks. We don't personally vet them usually. All of these things come into play worrying about security. This software company, are they located in the UK? Do they have allegiance to the UK? Are they located in a foreign country? Is that going to be a problem? Those general questions always come into play. And then there's always the question of, there's always individuals within companies that they themselves might have different ideologies and might want to harm the UK government. So you take these risks into consideration. There are several ways that we can handle that. One of the ways is having a certification program. There's various certifications out there that'll certify the entire company or sections of the company in security, specifically cybersecurity. These certifications are done by usually different government agencies or large other third-party cybersecurity companies, and they require very rigorous instructions on how to reach different levels of certification. In order to make sure that the company is up to standards, we could require them to be up to a certain level of security. For instance, there's one certification called CMMC. And what it does is it is a maturity model where they rate them from level 1 to level 5. And each level progresses up. Level 1 is basically no cybersecurity. Level 3 is very solid cybersecurity. And level 5 is actually pushing cybersecurity and preventing advanced attacks. So if we are going to go into business with a third-party company, we should require some kind of certification involved. We can also either in addition to or in place of have different contracts that specify different cybersecurity measures that have to be made in order to become a partner with us in developing or handling our software. And these contracts should apply to not just the ones developing it or not just the ones that we're directly purchasing from, but every company that is involved with the software and who might touch it at any point. Sometimes software is developed by one place, then it's sold by another place, then it's resold by another place, and then we finally acquire it in the organization. If that's the case, then all of that entire chain needs to have different certifications or different contracts in place that will assure the security of that software the entire way through the line. Some of the other risks to consider are within the actual software itself. No software is 100% perfect, and there's almost guaranteed to be some kind of vulnerabilities within software. That might sound kind of bad, but if you want to access and use the software, there's going to be some kind of vulnerability to it. Just think about email. Everyone uses email, and you have to be able to access it basically all the time in order for it to be useful. With that comes different vulnerabilities. People know you're going to check your email. They know you're likely to respond to email and click things in the email, which is where those phishing attacks come in. They send in links that go to places that let them download things on your computer, or they just send attachments that have malware on them. These things are mitigated by different technical measures of scanning attachments before they actually get to the recipient, or blocking different email addresses, these kinds of things. So all of these have to be taken into place. Another thing to consider is the actual physical security. A lot of times people don't, group physical security with cybersecurity, but they actually are very closely intertwined. You can have some of the greatest technical measures possible within a cybersecurity network, but if you leave the door unlocked and someone walks in and plugs something in, then that can mean nothing. You got to have physical security involved. You got to have locked doors. You got to have surveillance. You got to have these kinds of things. Logs that show who's going in and out. And these can all also be part of the contracts that are done with these third-party partners, so that we know that their physical security matches their regular cybersecurity. And oftentimes that's part of the certification, which is also why the certifications can be useful. There's also risk to be involved within the actual software development lifecycle itself. And that involves who is actually writing the software, where's the software being transferred, how is it being transferred, all of these things. So these can kind of tie into other things where there's different contracts that need to be put in place. If you're going to have people write the software, they need to be vetted, and they need to be able to pass a certain type of background check, for instance. If it's being transferred between companies, that transfer needs to be secure. How is it being transferred? Is it digital? Is it physical? Is the person who's physically carrying it vetted? Are the digital tunnels that it's going through secure up to a certain level? These kinds of things also need to be laid out in contracts for when software is acquired. That way, in all these contracts, it's not just to double check everybody, it's also for liability, because if something happens to that software when it gets to the organization, then that not only causes problems on the organization's end, but it causes delays. It causes wasted money. And so these contracts will keep these other companies liable. Like, hey, if something happens to the software where I'm holding it before I give it to the organization, I'm going to have to pay them money, or I'm going to lose out on this contract. So these kinds of things will keep everybody accountable. In certain instances, we can even put legal stipulations for criminal activity, since the organization is with the government. And if there's any criminal activity involved, then it specify in the contract that the fullest extent of the law will be prosecuted against some of these kinds of things. That way, it's very clearly laid out. These must be followed, and all of these things will help make the supply chain and the software itself more secure. But besides all of these contracts and these security measures trying to handle the different risks, there's also the process of actually acquiring or developing the software the organization is going to need. So the three basic ways that this acquisition or development goes is the organization internally develops the software, or we directly contract with another company to develop the software for us, or we simply buy the software from another large company like Microsoft or Dell or HP or any of these other places. Some of the advantages of developing it internally is that is the most secure way. It never came from outside of the building and will stay within the building. It stays within the organization itself. We know everyone who is developing it. We know the spaces they're working in. It's easier to control. The problem with that is that the teams and the people involved in developing it, that's not their only focus. The organization as a government agency doesn't have dedicated staff to developing software. So the team is going to be relatively small that can do it, and then they're going to have a split focus. And because the payroll for developing software will basically come directly out of their salaries, we can average around $400 to $500 an hour if a team of about 10 or 11 is working on it. And so that's kind of a high cost per hour, and it's going to take a long time because they're not dedicated to it. It's not the only part of the job. But this option can be used in several instances if the software is not going to be very large or very complex, and it's going to be for a very specific purpose within the organization only. If there's an organization department that says, hey, we need a tool or an application that can do this specific thing for us, and we really need it to be secure, then developing it internally might be the best idea for that. Another method is to directly contract with another company to develop software for the organization. This comes with the advantage of these other companies do have dedicated teams to develop software. So not only are they probably a little bit better at it, they'll be quicker and more efficient. They have the tools and capabilities to focus in on exactly what is needed. So they can get bigger, more complex projects done faster than our internal team can do even smaller projects. And these can run, usually a commercial estimate is around $150 an hour to develop an application. That can go up a lot and go up to 7 times that much, depending on how large the application is, how big the software is, how complex it is, all these things. But they're still able to do it a lot faster. So if the application or the software might be used company-wide, or it's for a specific department, but the complexity of it is just impossible for a small team to actually tackle within a reasonable amount of time, then contracting directly with another company to develop the software for us would be the best pick. This does add one more layer of security, but directly contracting with somebody is much simpler. There's only one extra layer to add, and the companies that directly contract with government agencies like the organization are usually already vetted to certain degrees and already have these certifications in place because they do business with the government. The other option is to acquire the software from other commercial companies or large companies. We need Microsoft Office for Word and Excel sheets. I purchase it through Microsoft or through a reseller who sells it. Different virtualization software to help optimize security and maintenance. These kinds of things are too big of projects to be done internally or through another organization, or there's no reason to reinvent the wheel and make another Word document program. And then when we try to go between agencies, we have one Word document program that might not mesh 100% with Microsoft Word or something else. And so it can cause bigger issues. So in that way, it's much simpler to buy through a large company. Not only because it will reduce the development time, but also the effectiveness of those tools is proven. Different virtualization software is proven to help security teams secure a network. Having Word documents and spreadsheets and email is proven to greatly improve productivity within an office. So these things are necessary for the offices and for the different departments to run. And while these purchases are usually very large, per employee and per year, they actually can run cheaper than the programs that are developed internally or through another company. For instance, Microsoft Office 365 is running about $120 per employee per year after a couple $1,000 or a few $1,000 up front. For the level of productivity that those software programs bring, that is well worth the money. And we're not going to be able to develop it and distribute it cheaper ourselves or through another contracted company. This is the most complex security-wise and risk-wise because there will be different partners involved. But that's where we can get into, we're going to test it before it comes in. And one of the best ways to test it is once it's acquired or once we get a sample of it, test it within a sandbox environment, which is completely separated from the rest of the organization's network. It's like a simulated mini network. So this program will go in there, test it, go over the code, make sure there's nothing malicious in there, make sure there's nothing giving extra vulnerabilities that we can't mitigate, and run it through these tests, make sure it works also before we distribute it out. And besides that, we can have all the contracts in place to make sure the supply chain is secure. Without those contracts, then yes, this method could be very dangerous to the organization. But that's why we have all these contracts, and that's why these certifications that I mentioned before are so important. Another option that's kind of off of that is acquiring free open source software. That might seem kind of odd, but there's a lot of free open source software that is very valuable, especially to different security teams. For instance, there's a security program, Wireshark, and there's another one called Autopsy. These programs are used by cybersecurity professionals and digital forensic professionals all over the world, but they're also free online. There's different options you get of these things where you can start paying, but generally you can get them for free online. And these tools are renowned over the world for being great at what they do. And there's a lot of different tools like that. The other perk to that is it is open source software. So the software code is reviewed by many different people throughout the world and can be reviewed by our security personnel before we acquire it, and can be acquired and tested very easily. Doesn't have to go through all these contracts, doesn't have to go through as many things. And it'll depend on the department whether or not the protocols in those departments will allow that. But a lot of the times it will, because it's very simple to acquire and very simple to check for security. So these are the very different methods that can be used for acquiring software, and then also went over different risk and vulnerabilities within the software and within the software development process and the supply chain. If there's any questions, please feel free to email me or call me. There's also several documents, including I wrote out a whole briefing for this specific talk here. Another document about the software development lifecycle itself, and then also different software development methods that can be used if we do decide to develop internally within the organization. Thank you very much for attending, and have a good rest of your day.